notice the Taza, for example, shows up in a lot of paintings, and to think about if that Taza changes the moon or any, like, it kind of made me think, like, how objects change, and maybe not taking every little piece as an input.
Right. Okay. Good. Other people want to add something to that? Yeah, Cynthia.
So like, it's not so related to what she said, but like, it really was interesting to me that they mentioned how in that century, the artists were really interested in like depicting the historical context of the time, but they would do it by depicting the past.
Right.
That was like interesting.
Yeah, so these things both kind of come to one thing, and I'll get the hands in the order I saw them. But with these two comments, one of the things that's really crucial, right, that is easy to forget because of the realism, is the degree to which, and I think I mentioned this when Margaret was up on stage, the degree to which everything in the picture is the result of a conscious choice on the part of the artist. And we just look at them almost like snapshots because they seem that way, right? But every one of Thomas's pictures has been put there for some particular reason. And the reason may just simply be mundane, right? That's what they always do, right? But some of it might be actually, rife with meaning. And in addition to the things that are included, and this is something that your comment gets to, Sydney, are the things that are not included, right? So you had mentioned a sort of a side thing. We're talking about ways in which we interpret a landscape. And Ann Jensen Adams, who teaches at University of Delaware, had written an article about when we see landscapes, we don't see modern manipulations of the landscape. We see traditional uses of the landscape instead. So we don't see current day, we see the past in a way, right? So, and I read that article with my grad class read that article actually, and she talks about the fact that one of the things that we see often are the polders, and we just don't see those. And the other thing we see are the canals between Harlem and, I mean, that's something we know about, that there were these canals between all the cities, and it was very easy to get, but we never see those. We see older types of transportation with rowboats and whatnot, right? So what we see is important. What we don't see is important, right? And that when we look at these images, now they're just talking about landscapes, right? But I think this is true for everything. All the pictures that we're looking at is that what the artist chooses to depict, and this is something Getty did in Lawrence Getty, right? Had written this book on shipwreck pictures that was very, very well received. And one of the things he talked about, as he mentioned here, is that he went back through all the shipwreck pictures he could see, and he realized that it's not a wide variation, right? And we look at landscapes, we don't see that many different things. We sort of see the same thing over and over again, and they're conventional, right? They're conventions. So you see this, you see this, you see this, you see this. Genre pictures, right? Letters. Why do we see so freaking many letters? There's a convention, right? That's just one of them. Or music makers, right? Ice scenes, right? Why do we so many of them? Why are there always people on the path? These are issues because there's a convention for that, right? And that for all of the realism that makes it look as if we're seeing everything there is to see in the 17th century in Holland, we really aren't. We're seeing a very, very limited choice of particular things, right? And that's kind of an interesting issue for all of us, right? So Shelley was mentioning her still lifes, right? Why choose those objects? Of all the, and is it just because he owned them, or is there something else to that?
Another thing that I thought about is that there's other objects that pop up in his other paintings that aren't in mine. So
right.
And one thing that also specifically, in my painting, there's no broken glass, but in a lot of his other ones, there
right.
is.
Or in Hades, but particularly, right? The Haida downtown at the you have. I thought you had Kloss.
No, I have Haida.
Okay, you have Haida. So there's in the National Gallery pictures, it's got a broken glass.
Right. Exactly.
Yours one doesn't.
It doesn't.
And so the question is, why are the things there and why are they not there? So Jesse, you had your hand up first, and then I had Jorge after that.
Yeah, just two things, kind of piggybacking off of what Sydney had said. I really thought it was interesting how, like, just historically they were talking about, depicting present wars as past
Mhm.
wars.
Mhm.
I thought that was really neat, and how like historical events in general.
Right, and that sort of fits with Livia's picture, right? The idea, the potential that the countenance of Scipio has something to do with contemporary events.
Yeah. And then I also really thought it was interesting how, they talked a lot about appeal to the imagination, and especially like with the windmills,
Mhm.
and depending on like the angle they choose to paint it at, or the people who kind of draw you in.
Mhm.
And like I feel like it's really easy to miss the minor things at first.
That's
But, like when you actually like it's each of these painters kind of every detail to them is like so important and
That's
draws to the bigger picture.
It's these are all, I think, incredibly important points, right? For one of the things that we can't figure out sitting here, especially for you guys with you're just getting your feet wet in Dutch Baroque art. To look at these things and realize that the windmill by Van Ruysdael is not up on a hill in reality, right? That the placement of these things has been altered and skewed somewhat, right? And that's something we don't get right away. And that's why with this assignment, I want you to go out and look. I want you to look. This next part of the assignment is as much looking as anything else. One of the things that we forget in an art history class is that for us, the pictures are a primary document. When we talk about history classes, you talk about primary and secondary documents, right? This is a secondary source. This article is, right? And we think about primary sources as being a historical record, right? Writing by Anne Frank, Corey Tyndall, something like that, right? That would be a primary source document. But we forget because of the aesthetic quality. These are primary source documents. And on one level, they can prove something historically accurate from a period like Thomas's Corner, what buildings were there at that particular moment. But on the other hand, they can then be documents that help us to understand the choices that the artists are making, the impact they have on the meaning. Right? So those are both very good points. Now, the issue of the history cast in the past, right, is important for Getty's argument because what he's saying is that there's a predilection, right? There's a propensity to generalize in the 17th century, right? To see the particular in terms of the generic, right? And so landscapes get pared down to types, right? And that is a very different issue, seeing the modern in terms of the past, but it is the idea of seeing the event, the particular, in terms of the repeated generic, right? Historical events that repeat themselves. So, those are both good points. Jorge.
I guess the article helped me realize a little bit more about how the people in my painting and the actual architecture of the fact that how the houses look older than how lively the city actually is, the little village actually is, and how that actually has an impact on like what he wanted, because it mentioned how they don't like to show commerce and things actually being built and happening like when they obtain the land. They like to show afterward, as if like this is human accomplishment and we know it because the people are there, but it's not showing the people making it.
That's right.
So like you see the commerce, you see the people getting the trade in my painting and pulling it in and out, and you see the village, but you don't see the village kept up.
And that goes to the point that he was making, which is that there's this plausible reality that invites you to participate, right? They invite you to imagine yourself within the picture, right? And I think that's not isolated to landscape. I think that's true with the genre pictures. This was still life. I read an article with the grad class about those reflections on those glasses, right? In the Frans Hals Museum, there's a whole room of those still lifes, right? And those beautiful reflections on the outsides of those glasses that bring you in. The knife that's coming out toward you, right? These things say, come in and participate, be part of the picture. But what Jorge's point is, they don't give you enough to limit anybody from participating. So if they made it obvious what the product and the delivery was, then it's only interesting to people who are interested in that. As it is, it's an open-ended question, right? That what's going on here? And I think with your picture, that's right. I think with Maeve's picture, that's the same thing, right? That they're going to give us clues that can lead us different directions, and sometimes those clues are going to be internally contradictory, right? They're going to say, "Oh yeah." Like I've always thought with your picture, that the broom in the foreground is just weird there, given the maids behind the woman, you know, and I didn't know that was sewing. I always thought it was just laundry.
Me too.
Yeah, right. So, but the placement of things, right, are there, and the inclusion of them, the exclusion of them. Vermeer's a master at exclusion. It's one of the things he does really well. And I think Sydney was talking about that with her pictures, the idea that with some of these things, they get excluded, right? Things are like not there for us anymore. And part of doing that, and we know that when Vermeer was working, he would do that. He would change things. So there's a picture in the Met of a maid asleep at a table, just like this. Yeah, like Olivia in the studio, in the conservations. But she's got sound asleep. And originally, right, and there's an upended dish, right? There's a glass on its side. And originally, there's an open door behind her. And originally, there was in the doorway a dog, fidelity. All of a sudden, there's a love theme now, right? And there was a soldier in the back room. So now there's something else entirely going on, and it locks it into a particular thing. And as he was working, he painted over it, right? So what this means for us, of course, is some of the things we learned about with X-rays and infrared in the conservation studio. These can be very important for us because they can tell us exactly, did Van Mieris paint something out? To open up the meaning in a different way. Did he change that dress that you were talking about, right? And in a way that says, okay, that means that really is important for us, right? For meaning. So conventionality is kind of a key element here, right? That artists are drawing on artistic tradition with great frequency in the 17th century. But we forget about it because they're so realistic looking, right? And that if they innovate within that, it'll be very incremental. Right? There's not going to be a huge splash. And this is true going back to Renaissance art. Right? One of the things, if you look at enough art, you realize this whole idea of groundbreaking innovation is kind of a modern idea. You know, your Jackson Pollocks and whatnot, who decide not to drip paint and whatnot. That's not something that for much of the history of art was ever an issue. That the much bigger issue was that art followed its own internal traditions, that it was very, very conventional. And what's interesting are, one, why do they choose to follow that convention? We've been thinking about that. By following the convention, what have they brought along? And then these incremental changes that we see made, or things that violate that convention, what do those do to the conventional meaning? Right? So we talked a lot with Shelley's picture, and also in class when we looked at still lifes, we talked about the fact that the same still lifes we can find in Mary Companies. But the innovation is we're getting rid of all the people, right? So what happens with that? I don't have an answer for it. These are the questions. Because what we're going to be doing with the rest of this class, we're just going to be asking some serious questions about what's going on with our pictures, right? And the only way we can ask really good questions is to determine conventionality versus innovation within that convention, right? If you don't know that, then your question's nowhere, right? So for your picture of the swan, I knew what it was. I was tongue-tied. Protecting your nest, right? We need to find out other pictures along those lines, right? We need to find out more about game pictures to see where this fits in within that kind of convention. Maybe you had your hand up.
Yeah, so, for this, for the, like, kind of the emblems that you see, you know, through the constant throughout, specifically in John painting, you know, you kind of wonder about maybe not everything in one picture is the same, and one picture is the other.
Mm-hmm.
Things like colors, like you can necessarily say, well, this color was symbolizing this or that. But what I was wondering was the origin of where those emblems and symbols are coming from. Because
That's
was that something
yeah.
invented by the artist and the community,
That's a
a
somewhat
past thing
different
versus
question.
in
Yeah.
culture. Oh, in Dutch culture, they make this as things.
That's a somewhat different question from what Getty's writing about, because Getty's not really talking about sort of the emblem approach.
Yeah. That's
There's an essay that I can give you on sort of that sort of got the the interpretive community talking about emblems and emblem books. Those really go back to, on one level, the whole idea that things in nature, and I mean that not just things made by man even, right? Things that you find in the physical world, have multiple allegorical meanings, is an idea that really goes back to the Middle Ages. And the idea that all of creation is God's handiwork and therefore reflects some element of his character. Which is why we always see flowers around the feet of the Virgin Mary when she's sitting outside. And each one of them is chosen specifically to sort of add to the character. But what Getty's suggesting is that while that might be helpful, sometimes we have to be careful because, again, it's not just this, I forget what he called it, the things where you stick things in compartments and all of a sudden you've figured out the picture. You know? Because there's more to it than that. And the convention is how things have always been arranged by this point in history. Right? And on a certain level, even when we go back to the Renaissance, which is, generation, 2 generations before this, we can find that compositions are extraordinary. The more I know about art history of the Renaissance and Baroque periods, the more I am struck with its conventionality. That what we see as important about art in the modern world, originality, expression, individual expression, is not as important with any frequency in earlier periods. That's really some invention of the Enlightenment, maybe a little bit later than that, 18th, 19th century. That said, there are some variations of this. Rembrandt's paint. There's nothing like that in the world, right? And Frans Hals and his paint, right? Not the figures or anything, just the paint on the surface, right? The thing I'll take away from that trip is Rembrandt's paint, I think. The corner of the table of the Syndics is the green that sort of erupts from beneath the red. Extraordinary stuff. And people did comment on that. People commented on Rembrandt's paint and how extraordinary it was. And same thing for Frans Hals, right? That they understood that as an innovation. So I'm not really answering your question, Maeve, because it's difficult in a way to find out exactly where that all started. The important thing, I think, for your interpretation of a genre picture in the late 17th century is not so much where it started, but what was widely known. Right? What was widely known in the 17th century. And with that in mind, that's why looking at multitudes of pictures, and I hope you're not writing in the library book. Oh, good. Oh, I didn't see that.
Somebody also already wrote this.
I always erase when I find that. Okay. The important thing is what people do, and part of that is not only the literary traditions and the emblem tradition, but also then when someone approached your picture, right? Or your picture. Would they look at it and say, aha, this reminds me of a dozen other pictures, but it's slightly different in this way? Or is it just yet another run-of-the-mill, I don't mean that badly, but you know what I mean? Run-of-the-mill sort of picture that way, right? And that's why it's important to get out and look at all these other things. Yeah? Now, one of the things that Getty's trying to get to, I don't know if you noticed this, but it's broken into 2 parts. It's part 1 and part 2, right? And part 1 really dives into this question we're talking about, which is what is conventional about 17th century Dutch art? Why is understanding conventions important to understanding the pictures? That's really kind of what he focuses on in part 1. And there's lots of meat in there for that, right? the importance of understanding the convention in order to understand the meaning in a way that a 17th century viewer would have understood that meaning. He makes reference to film studies. Umberto Eco, who wrote The Name of the Rose, was also a literary critic but a novelist. Passed away a couple years ago. Wrote about film and talked about sort of the ideal educated viewer, the one who can look at a Coen Brothers movie. What's Coen? Do you guys know the Coen Brothers? Fargo, No Country for Old Men, right? What was the last one? Buster Scruggs last year on Netflix, right? If you saw the Ballad of Buster Scruggs and you've seen enough westerns, you realize that they are just playing with themes that you see again and again and again, and they're doing it in a kind of fast, interesting way that reminds you of the tradition, but then changes it on you. Exactly right. And that's true going back to other older films, but there's some really savvy filmmakers out there that do that, right? There's other ones that don't really give much of a rip, right? But the Coen Brothers are a good example. They're film school geeks, right? Quentin Tarantino is another great example of this, right? He's just a film school geek, and understands that. So when John Travolta opens up that thing in the trunk and it glows, he never tells you what's inside of it in Pulp Fiction, right? Well, that's a direct reference of a 1950s movie called Murder My Sweet or something along those lines. It's a terrific film, a Mickey Spillane film, where what's inside is plutonium, and the girl explodes and erupts. And the same thing, Steven Spielberg in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and they open up and there's the glow coming out, right? And Tarantino knows that, and he knows that viewers know that. A good viewer, right? He's playing to the viewers who know that and can say, okay, I remember the Nazi in Raiders of the Lost Ark, and I remember the girl at the end of Murder My Sweet or whatever Murder My Love. Anyway, this 50s film, right? And he gets that and he brings it into it, right? Or maybe even Repo Man, right? Same thing, trunk full of something that glows, and he understands this reference heaviness, and so does Van Mieris, right? Right, and his ideal viewer, the one he's playing to, is the one that gets it and says, haha, but that costume doesn't look like a Vermeer costume, right? It's not so lurid as to be definitely a prostitute, but it certainly is not as proper as these other ones are, right? They're playing to that knowledge. So that's kind of the first part. It's talking about the importance of these conventions, and with the idea, this is an assumption we make in art history, right? Which is that paintings aren't accidental. Or if they are, there's something to be said about that as a process, right? But that paintings aren't, that when we're looking at stuff that has made it over 350 or 400 years to us, right, and landed in our laps, that the stuff that's there is there by design, right? And that infills a lot of what we do in art history. This is why the Rembrandt Research Project has pared down the group of Rembrandt paintings from what used to be about 800 to about 300. Because they don't want to assume that he had a Monday, that he ever had a hangover, right, and had to paint that day. But I've been in enough studio classes, and I used to fancy myself to be a pretty good draftsman. But you have days you cannot make the pen work. There are just days like that. You don't have to be hungover to have it happen, right? There are days when the hand-eye coordination just ain't working. You got to hang it up, or muscle through it. But you'll just come up with drawings, right? Dina, there's some drawings you have that you think are great, and there's some drawings that you make that you think are sucky, and there's no way to say why. It just didn't work. And we don't want to allow Rembrandt to do that.
Yeah, we don't want Rembrandt to think
Ever do a bad thing in his life, right? Except
like
for that creepy thing he did to his maid.
or something.
Sorry?
So we don't want him to put a negative impact.
That's right. We want to make every time Rembrandt touched the canvas, there's a masterpiece in the making, right? And never having a bad day. But some days you can write really well, right? And some days it just doesn't work, right? Is that way of swimming? Well, some days it's just like you, right? So anyway, this idea that everything in the picture is a deliberate choice on the part of the artist, right, is an assumption that we make, and it's not a bad assumption to make, right? And what we try to put together is how the choices that the artist made right? The final composition where they said, I'm done. How does that then communicate ideas to a 17th century audience? That's the difference between art history and art appreciation, right? So I don't care what you think, Margaret. I want to know what somebody in the 17th century thought. I do care, but you get my point, right? So, in this case, why wind blowing in, right? Why is it it must be a turning windmill, because if you look at the water, that has to be a windmill that's moving, right? That's actually working. That then means something. Why that particular Gothic building behind him, right? It looks like a church, a small chapel, right? What are our three maids there doing, walking along the path? Who are they about to encounter on the other? We assume this is all there for a reason, right? And sometimes the reason just be to get us to engage, right? But other times there's a lot more going on to it. Okay, so that's all this part one, right? Knowing the convention is crucial for being able to figure out what a painting means. The second part is kind of a case study. It's Goltzius. It's our old friend Goltzius, right? And lo and behold, we find out with our old friend Goltzius that there's something we haven't even talked about yet. The man is credited with everything else that we've seen him do, right? He's credited with being really one of the first realistic landscape painters, or draftsmen, right? One of the very, very first to actually make a realistic-looking landscape, right? Where, unlike with Matt's picture, where there's a slightly elevated point of view, right? Which makes it kind of unreal. It's like it's a drone photograph or something, right? He's imagined himself, Abercrombie has, on some sort of bridge that doesn't exist, right? He's imagined himself up in the air looking down, which is very conventional, right? But Goltzius brings the viewpoint down, right? I've got that drawing. Right? There's two Rembrandts. Some people pick this one as their favorite Rembrandt landscape, which I would agree. I love that. I really like that. Nice. And this is now back on view. Oh, Sunday. Can anybody come and hear the grad students talk about remember Sunday at 11 in under the dome at the National Gallery. We're going to go look at the Dutch paintings down there. And I know people work, and so I can't make it mandatory, right? But if you can, we're going to go pop around, look at the Rembrandts down there. Haida. We've got a Haida, right? We've got a Overkamp. We've got a Van der Neer. We've got De Hoog, right? We've got a Goltzius. We have a Goltzius painting on display there. We've got a Van der Heyden. We don't have a Van Mander. But there's so few of them, I'm not surprised. We have a Van Meurs, right? Pretty much everybody's right. We don't have an Asselin. But we do have some nice game pictures, right? So, everybody's down there. So we're going to meet at 11. There's two grad students who couldn't go to Amsterdam who are going to talk about their pictures like Margaret and Thomas did today. And I'd like them to have more of an audience than 4 other grad students. So if you can come, right? And I'm going to send an email saying, please respond if you're making it so I know to wait for you or look for you. But again, it's not mandatory. It's highly recommended. But I understand some people have to work. And I get that. So, okay, the second part is Goltzius. I don't know how I got on this whole national guy. This dawned on me right there, right? The second part is Goltzius. And what Goltzius, there's the drawing in Paris on the left, right? And what Goltzius did was to give us a realistic landscape, whereas the tradition had been much more fantastic. Right? But Getty says this in part 2. After having said that there are only incremental changes, right? That conventions rule the day. So how do we explain that? Right? And the issue is what we already know about Goltzius. Goltzius is this shapeshifter, right? Goltzius can do anything. I think that came true, right? When we're there, Goltzius can do anything, right? I don't think he's that great a painter, but I think when it comes to pen work, he can do anything he wants. And what we saw in the print room was how the works he does that are his have a particular style. But he can also then draw in an entirely different way, engrave in an entirely different way that looks like somebody else's style, right? And in this case, we know that he can do landscapes that are the traditional style, but he's chosen now to do a landscape in a new style. But the point that Getty's trying to get across is that that new style is part of this ongoing emulation, right? This idea of the shifting shapes. So this is by the same printing company that printed the Bruegel prints. But there seems to have been some interest in localized scenes. And Goltzius is picking up on these, right? And he's shifting his style, which is consistent with all of his work, to shift style, right? So in this case, this goes to the title of the essay, Naturalism as a Convention, right? Realism as a convention. Right? That in addition to the conventions of choices that the artists make for the letters or the taza, right, or the buildings and the rivers and the ferry boats, right? There's also other choices that we don't think about artists making because we don't think about art that way, which is that art is, the style is itself a conscious choice, right? And because of the way we go to art school, and when you take art class, I remember it's all the way back to 8th grade, find your personal style. And we're not taught to sort of, well, that's not true. I did a watercolor after a John Singer Sargent once, right? That I was kind of happy with. But I never sat down and tried to draw like Dürer, you know, or Michelangelo. Other than the form, I never tried to actually get the actual strokes like theirs, right? But that was the thing in the 17th century. That's how Rembrandt taught his pupils, right? Was to paint like Rembrandt, which is to the eternal consternation, right? The problem for connoisseurs, they look like Rembrandts, mostly, right? So Goltzius is able to shift shapes, right? He's able to become a different artist in a different work and do things that nobody else is sort of able to do, but look like other people's works. Any questions on the article? There's a lot of value here, I think, and one other thing I would like to say about this is the constant thing that I hear at every level of art history is, I can't find anything on my artist. Just remember that there are essays out there that could be extraordinarily helpful for how you approach interpreting things that you might say, you would not have known from this that there's something in there on Goltzius, right from the title. So even if the title doesn't, dig, keep looking, because there's things out there. Most of what I bring to a class when it comes to the things I know about these pictures comes from having read something about something else, not having read something about that picture. And when we talk about, this class is part of the liberal arts core, right? We talk, do you know the 4 values of the liberal arts core at Marymount? This is supposed to be the basis of your education. Critical thinking, written communication, global perspective,
Discovery, learning.
the inquiry-based learning. There you go. Good job. You got 3 of them right there. Okay, so critical thinking. What is critical thinking? That's the hardest thing to define, right? And we still wrestle with it upstairs, you know? But part of it is being able to read something over here and realize how it applies to something over there. And that's exactly the sort of skill that employers want from you guys when you leave here. They're not going to give you an art historical text, but they want to say, can you find something in your experience that applies to this problem that I need solved? Right? And so, you know, what's the point of taking art history class? It's not just to do good on Sunday crossword puzzles, you know, or whatever, although it helps. It helps with Jeopardy, right? Now Alex Trebek is dying, so yeah, he's got stage 4 prostate cancer. So sad. My dad had stage 4 prostate cancer. He's gone in 5 weeks. It's really, really harsh. He lost half his body weight, and it just went through him like nothing. It's the worst one out there, I think. It's worse than, in many ways, it's worse than brain. Yeah, Jimmy Carter had brain, right? And you look at him, he looks great. So, but he's got God on his side, so that helps a little bit. He really does, right? Anyhow, long and short of it, right? There are things out there in these essays that may not look like they're immediately valuable, but all of a sudden you go like, hey, wait a second, I can work with that. And what you're developing with that is a very, very high level of thoughtful skill. That if you can do that here, then you can do it anywhere. And you can, in fact, foreground that as a cover letter. What did you get from your university education, right? Marymount's so kind of hung up with career-based education. But why come to an institution like this then, and why not just go to a trade school? Because there's something that comes out of this class, or Kovach's philosophy class, or an economics class, right? That I don't know any of the economics profs by name, so I can't say them, right? Pomeroy, David. Holler, Brian. See, I know these people. And it's a small world. So Catherine England. Okay, very good. So something comes from one of Catherine England's economics classes that are skills that you'll have. And what you should be thinking about, students, is how can you craft a cover letter that talks about your experience here beyond your degree and your career path. And why did Marymount, 4 years, hopefully only 4, I was 7 as an undergrad. I didn't see an advisor. By the time I finally figured out I should be moving on, I was like 24 years old, and I had like 300 credit hours. It was 180 to graduate, 300 trimesters, and I graduated like 310. I didn't know what I wanted to do with my life. I was Richard Gere in An Officer and a Gentleman. I got nowhere else to go. I didn't know what I wanted to do, and then a professor pulled me aside. You should go to graduate school in art history. Okay. Pete David. Okay. And I went, and here I am. It was a default choice. We're almost out of time, and I've got a bunch of slides from the print room to show you, based on the things that you guys told me, right? Choices that you made, and let's just look at the 2 Goltziuses, right? And we'll look at more of them on Tuesday next. We'll get together, right? And move on from there. So these are the prints that we saw, right? These are the photos from the prints, which came out quite nicely. I'll tell you what, I was blown away. So you chose this, Jorge, didn't you? Yeah? It's a knockout, right? The things that I was really blown away with this, and I'd seen it before, but one is the range of line, right? Look at how lightly drawn the cloudscape behind him is, the smoke. And remember that the thickness of the line is the depth of the line. So the same tool he's using to carve those really thin lines that make up the clouds behind him, he's also using to carve those calligraphic lines that shade the lake. But add to that not only the sort of regularity of those strokes as they wrap, and all of them curve with the muscles, right, one way or the other, which I think is extraordinary. And it gives you that moire pattern, that diamond pattern. But in addition to that are the little ticks and dots, right? Look, here. Little ticks and dots in between the lines that become part. Goltzius just decided at one point, okay, there's not enough tone there. I need to add, or even on his calf, inside the diamonds, there's a extraordinary. It's worth looking at without even thinking about the subject matter. And then the other thing, I think I saw this in class as well. Notice his buttock. Okay, I can say that in art history class. Notice his buttock. But you'll notice that there's no line delineating the edge of the buttock. That it's where the line stops is how you get that line. But from a distance, you don't know, right? That the line, and that happens in his work a lot. And in fact, if you look at the other edge of his, the inner part of his thigh, I'm not doing this on purpose. I'm sorry. It sounds very sexual, but look at the lines up in here, right? And how it almost gives you the effect that line is on the surface of his body and kind of curves over, and like he's wearing mesh, over his body, and the line looks like it continues to the part of the body that you actually can't even see, right? Even though it's meant to be just shading, right? More of that lightness of the line, which we already talked about. And those horses, the horses are fantastic, right? I mean, they're not accurate, are they? I imagine a horse's legs can move that way. I'm not a big horse person, so I can't tell you for sure. But I do think that one of the things that Goltzius is working on here, a theme that's in the back of his head, because this is part of a series of prints, is, and by the way, look at how fine, look at the sun. Can you see that in the corner there? I didn't notice this when we were there. I only noticed it in my photographs, right? But those extraordinarily light lines, so just behind the chariot, there are lines that striate out, right? And they never cross each other, right? But they're so, just, he's barely touched the surface. They're grabbing just the tiniest amount of ink. So it must have been the most extraordinarily smooth piece of paper, right? Or, excuse me, copper surface to engrave on. But the horses, all four of them, we get four different views of horses, right? And if you look at the one that's in the detail here, and you look at this one here, it's like the same horse from different points of view, right? He's flipped it around. And he's imagining it, right? He's not posing horses. He just knows it so well that he can flip it in his mind. And for me, this is really fascinating because one of the things that Goltzius is, I think, playing with very strongly, and I think it's important for Van Mander as well. What is the status of the artist, right? What role does the artist play in society? Is the artist a craftsman? God, he is, right? But the artist is also a genius, right? And this idea of the artist as genius is really rare by 1600. It existed in Italy during the Renaissance. Michelangelo was a genius, right? And was seen as such and recognized as such by his patrons. But that's the rarity, right? Artists were craftsmen primarily. And Goltzius is playing with this idea of the artist as genius, right? There's one who can imagine things in three dimensions. But add to that this ongoing issue between sculptors and painters, right? Sculptors said their art was better, and painters said, no, our art is better. And the arguments that they gave, right, in this old debate was that sculptors said, I make things in three dimensions. Painters said, I can give a landscape setting or an architectural setting, right? Your setting is dependent on where you place your sculpture, but I get to create space, right? That's kind of the basics of, and then went further than that. Well, Goltzius is here painting like a sculptor. Does that make sense? He's got a setting, and he's got the figure in three dimensions, right? You can see it from both sides. And as a printmaker, because that's all he's doing at this point, he's not painting, right? He actually is a sculptor who makes things that are kind of like paintings and have a tonal range like paintings. So these are just utterly fascinating things, right? Jorge, the hand again, right? The one down below. And this was part of a series of 4 prints that he did. And when we look at them, there are 4 of these that go side. This is the one from the National Gallery, an impression from the National Gallery, right? But I only had him bring out the one because there wasn't enough room in the room, right? So here's Icarus, the much more famous story, right? Flew too close to the sun, right? But you'll notice that that's kind of the same pose. One leg up, one leg down, seen from the front, seen from the back, right?
It kind of feels like Goltzius might have flipped the coin or something.
That's right. It's exactly right. It's the same figure seen from both sides, and has that same sort of, and again, within the setting. So he's playing with this idea of what it means to be a sculptor. The other 2 in this series of 4, same idea, right? And these ones have, obviously, you can see how he's seen these as pairs. Those 2 had very light backgrounds. These 2 have very dark backgrounds, right? But all 4 of them are people who fell from the heavens in Greek mythology, right? And in these ones as well, look again at the placement of the legs, right? And you can see that what he's playing with, they're not exactly the same pose, but they're close enough that he's, somebody talked about this when we were in the print room, he's showing off talent. Was that you that brought that up in the print room? Yeah, there's something about these images that are about, at the one time showing off talent, but then the theme of these 4 images are people who thought too much of themselves, right? And that's just really kind of a fascinating bit. The biggest winner, more people voted for the Farnese Hercules than anything. It's better live, isn't it? It's a nice butt. Yes, and usually, now here's the interesting thing about that. 2 things about that, and then we'll quit, right? First, I brought the great Hercules on the left end because Jorge taught me something. So for those of you who were not in the group with Jorge, he noticed this, that Hercules' hand is Goltzius' hand, because I had already commented on how weird that vein that runs at the base of those knuckles is. You know, it's just an odd vein. And you noticed that it was exactly the same, right? Because you had just been to Harlem and seen the reproduction of that, right? So I think that, one thing, we see Goltzius, that hand for Goltzius, I would like to trace it through all the prints and find out where it is. And then do something with that, right? What does it mean for Hercules' hand, right? So anyway, I found that to be, thank you. I had not ever seen that before. But with the Farnese Hercules, it ties into the exact same things we were just talking about, right? So on the one hand, it's about looking at sculpture, but he's in the painting camp, even though he's a printmaker, right? And we have these figures who are looking at him from one side, but we look at him from the other side. So it's this idea of that is an object that can be seen from both sides. That is his answer to the old argument. He can make images that can be seen from multiple points of view. Add into that when you see classical, this is a Hellenistic Greek sculpture, the vast majority of those and Renaissance sculptures were meant to be seen from the point of view of those guys, from the other side. So your comment about his anatomy is spot on, but it's also important because what Goltzius is showing us is the untraditional view. And the fact that Michelangelo's David looks horrible from the back. He's really got like an ugly butt, right? It's kind of saggy, it's weird. The reason you see Michelangelo's David from the front is because he carved it to be seen from the front. And the sculptor of this, Glykos, I think his name is, of the original statue, right? Carved it to be seen from the other side. It was meant to be placed up against a wall. So this view, however pleasing it may be, for whatever reason, right, is not a view that he gave as much attention to as the other side. And what Goltzius has done is he's taken the secondary view, made it primary, made the less important view extraordinarily sexy, right? Because it is. It's just, especially compared to that other lumpy, he's still lumpy, right? Goltzius is still kind of mannerist, right? But here again, we can see how many implied lines there are for the edge of things, right? It's almost like he's made out of mesh. Right? Everywhere you look, and those dots that appear in between the calligraphic lines, right? Somebody compared his work to penmanship manuals. And they talked about the fact that for penmanship, if you took penmanship school, one of the things you had to do was to create a perfectly curved arced line, right? That was part of penmanship school, and that these seem to reflect that element, right, of penmanship. Great details came out. My new lens that Mary bought for me worked very well that day, right? And they're just for Margaret, right, as well, because these round forms, he loves round forms, and I think part of it comes from this idea of penmanship having that perfect curve. So, his extraordinarily tight buttocks, right, come from that interest in sort of tight curvilinear patterns, right? Yeah. Okay. And there you go, right? Even closer still. But again, look at those external. You can see the edge of the burin, the carving tool, right? That makes these little diamond shapes when he just bangs it. So he's taking imagine it was this. I'm not going to, but it's going with perfect and perfectly in the center, right? Every one of these right in here, right? It's just perfectly in the center of that diamond. And you remember how big that detail is, right? He rocks my boat, right? and then he can do that, which doesn't look anything like it, right? He can, and this is 2 years later, right? And he's just showing off that he can engrave like Dürer can engrave, you know, and he can do these kinds of things that don't look like Goltzius anymore, right? What an amazing person, right? Okay, I kept you a little bit late. Hey, there's an art opening tonight at the Berry Gallery at 6, free wine and beer and food for those of you who can. 21. But there's other non-alcoholic beverages, but it's right over the Berry Gallery at 6 o'clock, so come if you can.